Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Strong Collectors Podcast. I'm your host, Dakota, and today we're going to be talking about how to display and how maybe not to display. Now, every display is going to fit the person, so what may fit my needs may not fit yours, my tastes may be different than yours, but I think in general, most collectors would agree with this. Now, before we get into that, make sure you are entered to win our giveaways. We have 2 giveaways going on right now. You can go back and enter. One is going to be on the comic capsule review. That's to win a Conan the Barbarian #1, and that's within the comic capsule. You get both of those. And then the other is going to be on our Marvel Legends from Hasbro that we want updated, and that'll be an Emma Frost cover, also with a comic capsule. So go back, watch those videos, and then that'll tell you how to enter. And then we'll be doing that giveaway probably next week. So stay on the lookout because that is only 2 of our giveaways. We're going to have 2 more coming, and then we've got quite a few lined up after that. So stay tuned. Make sure you're subscribed. Be watching all of our videos, and make sure you stick around because a lot of times we throw in some extra entries. So without any further ado, let's get into displaying. So right now you can kind of see I have a green screen. We're moving into a bus, so I don't really have anywhere to display my figures, but I'll kind of talk about how I had my display set up when we were in our apartment. So again, your space is going to be a limiting factor for a lot of us. Whether you're in an apartment, you've got a house, you've got a whole dedicated toy room, maybe you've got an entire basement. So again, this is going to be kind of dependent on the person, and you can have multiple displays in multiple different ways. And I'm going to kind of show you how I've had several different displays within my display. So here's a look at what I had before we started moving. We'll get into kind of each of the displays kind of more in detail, but you can kind of see I've got posters up on the wall. I've got mostly loose figures. I've got some art on the wall as well. We've got graded comics. I'll also show some raw comics. I've got a Fortnite mask up there, a HasLab, Marvel Legends, McFarlane's. So a lot of components here. We'll kind of break down different ways people display and kind of at least my tastes, and like I said, probably most people's tastes. So let's start out with inbox collecting. To me, inbox collecting is probably the least appealing. So this first picture here is just kind of an example of somebody had some extra Mythic Legions. They're planning on selling a lot of these. So this isn't necessarily their display. However, I have seen a lot of displays like this. For some reason, I usually see this with DC Multiverse. A lot of folks are displaying those in box, and it's just kind of like stacked up like that. It is kind of cool because, you know, it kind of gives you that like toy store feel, but to me, it feels a little too hoarderish for my tastes personally. I do like to keep some things in box, and the things that I do like to keep in box are the Spider-Man retro cards. Again, I think there are different ways to even display your inbox collection. To me, this isn't bad, and none of these are necessarily bad per se, they're just not my taste. For me, I like the kind of just the quick look at this, but then at the same time, I can't really see any of the figures other than whoever's in the front, and even that is kind of hard to see. Like you can barely see Spider-Man on the bottom there. Peter Parker on the side's pretty hard to see. You can really only see Sandman. Again, the retro cards look kind of cool lined up like this, but it wouldn't be my ideal way to display, and especially with those Venom boxes down on the bottom, you don't even really know that's Venom other than like we collectors that have it or have seen it, we know. But if you didn't know that was Venom, it's just a black box down there. Maybe there's some writing on the side. Really hard to tell. The way I do inbox collecting, or how I did, was I would mainly use retro cards, but then I also used a few Toy Biz boxes. But then I would also intermingle in some loose figures as well. So I would kind of use the box as a platform, pose up one of my figures, and then have them in like a combination style. So to me, I like having the retro cards displayed like this, flat on the wall, so that you can see the entire art of the box, and then you still get to see that figure inside there. Again, I'm mainly a loose collector. I like to keep some of the retro cards on card, but very few. Even most of these I've either opened or sold since this. And then the Toy Biz Series 1 are really the only things that I think I'm going to like for sure keep in box, unless it's like I'm trying to collect a character, and even that I don't think I've specifically have that. For me, it was more of like, if I'm not ready to set up a full display with a character, especially in these retro cards, I was going to leave them on the retro card until I was ready to like pose or photograph. things like that, because they look cool and they display well, like this. Now, this was one of my favorite displays because it's combining loose figures, sealed figures, and the issue #1 comic. So I used some risers here from Amazon. I'll put a link down in the description of what those are. They're like super cheap and you get a bunch of them, but I think they add layers to your display so that you can raise some things above others. It really fills in the shelf. Having the boxes in the back raised up, and then the comic also raised up in that like plastic display protector thing. I think I got that from like a movie gallery going out of business, but then I've also got a loose figure displayed up with that comic. So, and then I've got each of the characters kind of displayed. I mean, Thane the gorilla is a little bit vanilla, but the other ones are kind of in their like battle ready poses. You've got Kali showing off his weapons. So I prefer that kind of look where each individual figure is more so striking a pose versus the more vanilla. Like even I've got the soldier up in the background. He's a little bit more like hunched over. To me, it just gives him a little bit more personality versus just standing straight up. So now focusing mostly on loose collecting, this is probably my least favorite, or this is for sure my least favorite way of displaying or seeing displays, because when they're all stacked in like this is how I store figures that I'm trying to sell, because from a box, I can look at it up top, see who it is, pull them out. But when you're looking straight on in a display, you're really only seeing the front row, and even that just looks cluttered. You've got everybody pressed up, nuts to butts, Jordan's favorite. To me, it's kind of like, why even have the characters in the middle or the back on display? Because you can't see them. I get it if space is an issue and you need to, you have to display your figures or you just can't have them. That's one thing. But if you could, I would put these in a box and then just rotate displays. That's what Jordan and I do. So this really is my least favorite. But again, you got to do what you got to do sometimes. Now, getting slightly better, this is that same style of, just as many figures as you can possibly fit on a shelf. However, you've got a little bit of posing here. You can see Batman kind of in somewhat of an action pose, Riddler sitting on the throne, but then you've got some, I would assume some of those levels, or maybe it's like a plastic spice rack that's kind of giving you that stair step effect where the figures in the back aren't as hidden as they were in the previous picture. Because they're on those risers, then you at least see all the figures, even though they're packed in really tightly. The last couple examples of this, again, you're getting a little bit more dynamic displays here with Silver Surfer flying off the shelf. You've got Beast and Spider-Man up above. Again, this is a little bit better than just totally smushed in, but again, they are still smushed. So for me, I would rather store figures and then be able to display figures and really showcase them. This one here is a picture of somebody just starting their collection. And I think this one makes some sense because, you're putting the bigger figures in the back, the little bit smaller figures in the front, and then you can still kind of see who pretty much everyone is here. And this would be about like a maxed out display, at least for a level display like this. If there was some risers here, I think it would be a pretty good display, at least in displaying vanilla figures. For me though, I prefer much more of like a dynamic pose. So this is a good example of a lot of figures on one display, but each figure kind of has their own unique stance, or, they're getting ready to attack, or they're swinging into action, things like that just kind of bring the figure to life a little bit more, because these are articulated figures. And what's the point of having them articulated if you're just going to have them standing straight up and down military style? So I also love that this one has levels to the display where you've got some of your flying characters up above on flight stands or using something to attach them to the wall. You've also got bigger figures in there, like the Toy Biz Build-A-Figure Giant Man. You've got the Goliath figure from Marvel Universe. So just different levels in the display. And then it also kind of has more of like, it's all coming up to a point at the top of Thor's lightning effect. So I think that's kind of cool visually, versus just kind of having it chaotically, some are flying, some are down. This makes sense and it looks pretty nice. Now we'll get into my displays and how I was doing it. Now, again, caveat is I want these to look good for me, but then I also was trying to make these look good on camera. For me, when I was trying to add in like boxes behind figures, it just got lost in the camera. Like the camera couldn't really differentiate the depth there. So I didn't like having tons of layers to my display unless they were stacked up like this. So I've got Red Skull, Arnim Zola on their own risers, and then I've got 3 kind of stacked up with my Nick Fury, Mariah Hill, and Black Widow. and even MODOK is on a stand up above the AIM soldiers. So again, I'm not trying to have everybody packed in here. I have more army builders for each of these groups, but I didn't want it to get too crowded where you lost the dynamic display of each character. After a while, I got more shield and more Hydra, so I swapped out the AIM and then added them in. But still, again, you see everybody's kind of got their space. Nobody's too crowded. You can still see each figure individually. And then I tried to have each figure, even though they're army builders and they look the same, I kind of wanted them each in their own individual pose, and then try to make them as different as possible. So I had several of the female agent bodies so that I would swap on Black Widow's head with a Quake wrist guard and then the bandana from Moira McTaggart, just to give each person their own individual identity. And then a little bit more typical of how I was displaying was kind of just a single row of figures in their kind of like heroic stance. So this is my Mythic Legion demon army, or at least most of them. So Mythic Legions aren't quite as dynamic posing as Marvel Legends, and when they are, they're not going to stay in that pose super well, at least in my experience. So they're slightly more vanilla, but I still wanted them in some sort of like heroic stance. So they're either holding their weapon, looking kind of like they're staring somebody down, versus just standing straight up and down like they're guarding the castle. So I want them to feel a little bit more of that main character energy. Another example, I kind of had my Marvel Knights. I used a few different base accessories for this one to try and hide some of the flight stands, at least with Spider-Man over there on the side. You can kind of see I've got the Series 1 Iron Man Stark display kind of on the ground. You still see the flight stand back there. Got the other flight stand kind of knocked over in front of the Iron Man. And then, I've got Shang-Chi in a kicking pose flying over the top of Iron Man. Moon Knight is on the Spider-Man Classics Rhino base. And then this is kind of an example of how you can mix different Marvel Legends together, because typically your Toy Biz figures don't look as good with your Hasbros, but the bases here I think work pretty well. Maybe a little bit more bases would kind of make this look a little bit more diorama-y versus bookshelf-y. But then, my Toy Biz Iron Fist is my favorite look for Iron Fist versus what we had from Hasbro. I think the new one coming out is going to be much better, but this was the look I liked, so I used him. And then again, fitting the space needs, I wanted to move my Marvel Knights over to the black shelf. They're a little bit more narrow, so I had to cut out a couple characters, and then I swapped in Elektra. And then this is a way that you can kind of hide defects. So this Elektra has a broken foot, but you can't tell because I have her kind of sliding in the action pose where that broken foot is back behind her, and you can't really tell that it's broken unless I tell you that. So again, just different ways to display and hide your defects. Now here I kind of get into wanting my figures to be like coming off of the shelf. This one, just to start, is like a very full shelf. Like I've got Venom back there, and he takes up a lot of that blank space behind that I would usually have in the displays like you saw before with the Marvel Knights. But then I've also got, Toxin's hand is slightly curling outside of the shelf display there. Null's sword is dipping down below the shelf. And then I've got the Carnage drones. You can kind of see their feet and tendrils and hands are like coming out at you. So I liked the dynamic aspect of this display, and we're going to kind of get into that as we keep going through. But just kind of adds in a little bit more life into a very full shelf. And again, with the kind of coming off the page of the comic or coming off the shelf, I've got the Giant Man here lifting Wasp up out of the display. She's up above that next shelf there, but then just adding in some flight stands to try and fill in the space. Probably could have added in another character in between that like hole between Cap, Thor, and Giant Man. Again, though, I'm trying to make it so each of these stands out on camera and you can see them back behind me. So it's going to be like, you're watching a small screen with a small shelf that's a distance away from the camera. So some aspects that to my display may be different than yours, but something that you could keep in mind. And then I think this is my last display, like with an example of coming off the shelf. So I've got what I would classify more as the main characters of this display. Headless Horseman and the Centaur Apharius are kind of within the display, along with the other two characters in the middle. But then you've got Thump, who, to me, he's just kind of sitting off to the side, not really in any sort of battle. He's just relaxing, looking out the window. He's got his feet dangling off the edge. I just thought that was kind of a fun, like, personality boost for this character. So something you could do maybe with your Deadpools or kind of more goofy characters like that. And then getting into the big character, HasLab Galactus. So this one I tried to have some depth with figures flying from the ceiling. So I've just got them strung up with fishing line. Probably could be better ways to do that so you don't see the tacks up there. But when you're looking at it straight on, it's pretty good. And then I've got kind of the battle going on down below. Frankie Ray Nova is up on a flight stand along with Iron Man. I think if I was going to have this display a little bit more permanently, I may have done just some small fishing wire with characters hanging from his hands to kind of fill in that gap between his knees and like upper torso area. But just as far as like a dynamic display, this one is getting into a little bit more scene building. So we've got Morg here slashing down on Captain America. And then you can kind of build off of that, like we're going to see here next. This is probably the best display I've ever seen for Galactus. This is like a whole dio. So I totally understand if you don't have this. There's a lot of custom pieces here with the cosmic effects, the lights, the clouds, the portals. Like I said, best one I've ever seen. Hard to top this, but it's really displaying a scene, and you can kind of feel like characters are coming out of the portal. They're battling Galactus and his heralds. Again, don't expect to see this very often, but when you do, it's very cool. Now to a little bit smaller of a scale, you've got this dio of kind of the X-Mansion lawn and all of the X-Men fighting Onslaught. So you can look at this and see that there's a scene happening, and you get that action feel. You see the characters doing battle, or at least in my head, I see a lot of animation with this. You've got everybody is in an action pose. You've got Wolverine and Beast jumping into the action. Storm's back there with her lightning effects. You've got force fields up in the front, blast effects, magnetic effects, ice slide for Iceman. This is a very action-packed scene. If you don't have a whole dio setup like this is a display I set up with just one of those black shelves like I showed earlier, but I used a few of my Vault Guards, used some of the web effects from one of the Spider-Mans, and then just some random weapon effects just lying on the ground. And then I've got Venom kind of tearing through the Vault Guards. And then this is just like a red light and a blue light, but it still looks good just as is if you just have it as your normal display. But again, you're kind of telling that story with your display. Makes it a little bit more fun than those just standing straight up and down. Now getting into some more holiday displays that I've done. So these I only had up during one Christmas time, but it was kind of fun to use kind of that smaller Christmas tree. And then I've got the heroes all decorating it. I've got Spider-Man hanging up from the wall, shooting his webs, kind of, adding to the decorations. I've got blast effects in there. I've got, I think, Polaris's effects in there, just as like Christmas tree decorations. Then I've got this dance party scene. I've got J. Jonah Jameson striking the Michael Jackson pose. Stan Lee, Red Hood, and MJ all dancing under the disco ball, which is just a Christmas ornament on, I think that's just like a Christmas napkin. And then the last Christmas display is Red Skull just telling Christmas stories by the fire. He's holding the Cosmic Cube, the Tesseract. You've got Arnim Zola back there, and then he's got kind of his henchmen just sitting cross-legged listening to the stories. So again, just a fun way to display your figures in something different than maybe what you would think of. So just trying to get creative. And with most of our figures, they're coming from comic books, or there are books and stories about them. So I think it's kind of fun to add in some of those books into your display with the figures. So here I've got the X-Men animated series, art and making, so kind of like a coffee table book, cool art design on it. And then I've got my animated series Wolverine. So along with displaying the coffee table books, you can also display the graded comics or just raw comics like I showed before with the Animal Warriors of the Kingdom. So here I've got Haunt, and then he's displayed next to the CGC 9.8 comic here. Got that in a trade, so I was like, hey, this would be a great way to display kind of a cheaper figure, make the display look kind of cool. Probably my favorite way that I've displayed my comics with my characters is this Avengers #1. So I've got that displayed with a few of my Avengers here. I think I ended up getting the actual Heroes Return Iron Man and swapping it out, but I've got kind of Thor in the same pose that he's in. I tried to get Captain America as close as he could. Hawkeye, same pose. If I had Scarlet Witch, I'd probably throw her in here. And then I did also end up putting Retro Beast on this one, but I guess I didn't get a picture of that. But, trust me, it looked cool. And then lastly, I have this display that is just a hodgepodge of random cool figures that I liked. This was kind of my like sort of expensive display because I've got my two Mafexes here. The Marvel Legends Spider-Man obviously isn't that expensive, but Mezco Wolverine, and then the Build-A-Figure King Shark. And this is just kind of an example of the display doesn't necessarily need to make sense as long as you think it's cool. So again, I tried to add some depth to it where I've got Spider-Man on a flight stand and a riser, and then I've got Asbat on the riser and a flight stand, and he kind of fills in with his cape up there. But these are different lines, different characters, different universes, but they all looked cool to me, so that was why I built them that way. So all of that to say that really the displays are up to you, but hopefully this kind of gave you some ideas of how to display differently or maybe add in a little bit more creativity. I'll link down below the risers that I usually use, and then the wire flight stands that I was using are just flight stands. I looked up how to make custom homemade flight stands or something like that on YouTube, watched a video. The wire cost me, I think, $15 to $20. I've made probably 15 or more flight stands, and I still have a ton of wire left over. So that's a pretty cheap option. You could also go the plastic route. Some figures work better for that. Some figures I like better with the wire. Play around with it. You can leave comments. I can answer more questions about that if you're interested in it. Make sure you go back, watch our Hasbro Marvel Legends that we want to see updated. Make sure you get entered to win that giveaway. Like I said, we're going to be closing that pretty soon. Until next time, make sure you like, share, and subscribe, and stay strong.